Picture the image everyone carries around in their head. Tall, blonde, blue-eyed warriors sailing longships out of the Scandinavian fjords, a genetically pure Nordic bloodline, forged by ice and isolation. In 2020, a team of geneticists sequenced the DNA of 442 actual Viking-era skeletons pulled from archaeological sites scattered across Europe and Greenland, the largest genetic study of its kind ever conducted. What they found didn't just complicate that image, it dismantled it completely. Some of the men buried with full Viking ceremonial honors, weapons, boats, the works, carried no Scandinavian ancestry at all. Modern Scandinavians, according to the study's own authors, carry only a modest fraction of genuine Viking-era DNA. And underneath all of it sits a genetic bottleneck so severe in one specific Nordic country that it nearly erased that population's genetic diversity entirely. This is what the actual science says happened to the people we call Vikings, and it looks almost nothing like the version sold in museums, tourism campaigns, and 1,000 years of national mythology. To understand why this matters, you first have to understand exactly how strange the geography of the Nordic region actually is, because geography is the entire reason any of this happened the way it did. Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, and Iceland sit at the very edge of habitable Europe, a region of roughly 27 million people, collectively occupying some of the harshest, most physically isolating terrain on the continent. Brutal winters, short growing seasons, deep fjords, dense forests, and mountain ranges cut communities off from each other for generation after generation. That kind of isolation does something specific and measurable to a population's genetics. In a large, well-connected population, unusual genetic traits tend to get diluted quickly through constant intermarriage with outsiders. In small, isolated pockets, the opposite happens. Traits get locked in, concentrated, and passed down with a level of consistency you don't see almost anywhere else in Europe. The Nordic countries function, in a very real sense, as a natural laboratory for exactly this kind of genetic isolation effect, and researchers have spent the last decade and a half using increasingly sophisticated tools to figure out precisely how it played out. Here's something that consistently surprises people once they actually look at the data. Despite sharing broadly similar cultures, a shared Viking-era history, and languages that sound remarkably alike on the surface, Norwegians, Swedes, Danes, and Finns are nowhere near as genetically uniform as most casual observers assume. And one of these populations in particular turns out to be so genetically distinct from its immediate neighbors that early researchers genuinely struggle to explain why. That specific mystery is the right place to actually start this story, because it forces you to abandon the Nordic people are all basically Vikings narrative almost immediately. Listen to Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish spoken side by side, and the similarity is obvious even to untrained ears. Linguists classify them as a dialect continuum, meaning speakers of one can often understand speakers of another without ever formally studying the language. Because all three descend directly from Old Norse, the language the Vikings themselves actually spoke and carried across the seas during their raids and settlements. Now, listen to Finnish. It sounds like nothing else in the region because it isn't related to its neighbors at all. Finnish belongs to an entirely separate language family, the Uralic family, distantly related to Estonian and more distantly still to Hungarian. Finland sits geographically right in the middle of the broader Nordic and Baltic region, surrounded on every side by Germanic-speaking neighbors, and somehow retained a language that arrived from a completely different linguistic direction thousands of years earlier. That's not simply a linguistic curiosity to file away. It's a direct signal hiding in plain sight that the underlying population history beneath these countries doesn't match the simplified Nordic people are all one people story most casual observers assume going in. To understand where all of this genetic and linguistic divergence actually comes from, You have to go back much further than the Viking Age itself, all the way to the end of the last ice age. As the glaciers began retreating roughly 11,000 years ago, small groups of hunter-gatherers started pushing north, following retreating ice and the reindeer herds that came with it, into newly exposed, barely habitable land. This wasn't one unified group, moving in a single direction. Genetic and archaeological evidence points to at least two separate migration routes converging on the region, one moving up through what is now Denmark and southern Sweden, and a second sweeping in along the Arctic coastline from the east, with genetic ties reaching back toward populations much further into Siberia. These earliest populations were sparse and scattered, fighting for survival against a landscape actively working against them at every turn. Then, roughly 4,000 years ago, the genetic picture shifted dramatically again. A large wave of migration swept into Scandinavia from the Pontic steppe, the same broadly Yamnaya-related population movement that reshaped the genetic makeup of much of the rest of Europe during the same period. These migrants brought new technology, new burial customs, and a genetic signature that would go on to become deeply embedded in the Nordic gene pool for millennia afterward, still detectable in the region's population today. By the time the Viking Age actually begins, conventionally dated to around 800 CE, you're not looking at a single unified population that simply expanded outward from one common source. You're looking at the layered descendants of Ice Age hunter-gatherers, steppe migrants, and successive waves of early farmers, all stacked on top of each other across several thousand years, scattered into isolated valleys and fjords that, in many cases, had remarkably limited genetic contact with each other even after centuries of shared cultural development. This is exactly the kind of layered, fragmented population history that historians and geneticists have spent decades arguing over, and it's worth being direct about how badly this specific topic has been misused historically before getting into what the actual current research shows. For well over a century, the idea of a pure, biologically unified Nordic race was hijacked by some of the ugliest ideological movements of the modern era. 19th and early 20th century race scientists became fixated on blonde hair and blue eyes specifically, treating Scandinavian populations as some kind of genetically untouched, biologically superior group. That entire framework collapsed under the weight of its own bad methodology, both scientifically and morally, decades ago. But the underlying myth of Nordic genetic purity never fully disappeared from popular culture, and it still surfaces today in tourism marketing, popular media, and, less innocently, in various corners of the Internet. The actual legitimate historical and genetic debate among serious researchers has always been considerably more nuanced than that. Some scholars argued the Viking Age represented a genuinely unified Scandinavian expansion outward, raiders and traders carrying a shared Norse cultural identity to Britain, Ireland, Iceland, and beyond. Others pushed back directly against that framing, arguing the so-called Viking world was actually a patchwork of competing, genetically distinct regional groups that happened to share a common language and a handful of overlapping cultural practices, rather than anything resembling a single, cohesive ethnic group acting in concert. And sitting slightly outside this entire debate is Finland, whose genetic distinctiveness raised its own separate, unresolved question for decades. Was Finland's population always genetically separate from its immediate Nordic neighbors, or did something specific happen historically that pushed it toward this particular kind of isolation? For a long time, nobody could answer that question with any real confidence, because old chronicles, place names, and surface-level historical records could only carry the investigation so far. What finally cracked this open wasn't another historian working from written records. It was a geneticist working directly with ancient bones, and the last decade and a half of ancient DNA research has genuinely rewritten the Nordic origin story from the ground up. Some of the specific findings that have come out of this research are startling, even by the normally high standards of this particular scientific field. Research conducted through institutions including the University of Copenhagen's Globe Institute, home to the Geogenetics Center, led by Eske Willerslev, along with collaborating researchers at the Max Planck Institute and elsewhere, has sequenced hundreds of ancient Scandinavian skeletons spanning thousands of years of continuous population history. One of the most significant and well-documented findings to come out of this broader research effort concerns Finland specifically. Genetic analysis has established that Finnish populations experienced a severe population bottleneck within the last several thousand years, a dramatic, measurable reduction in overall genetic diversity, most likely caused by a relatively small founding population expanding to fill a sparsely inhabited landscape. That specific bottleneck event is precisely why Finnish genetics looks so genuinely distinct from its immediate Nordic neighbors today. Despite Finland sitting geographically right in the middle of the broader Scandinavian and Baltic region, it's a textbook example of a founder effect, the same basic genetic mechanism population geneticists have documented in isolated communities across the world, from Iceland to parts of the Amish population in North America, playing out at national scale. Then there's the Viking Age itself, and this is where the largest and most consequential piece of research directly enters the picture. In September 2020, a landmark study titled Population Genomics of the Viking World was published in the journal Nature, led by researcher Ashut Margarian of the University of Copenhagen's Geogenetics Center, working alongside a large international team that included senior author Eske Willerslev. The research team sequenced the genomes of 442 individuals recovered from archaeological sites spanning Europe and Greenland, representing, at the time of publication, the largest ancient DNA study of Viking-era populations ever conducted, the product of roughly 6 years of sustained research work. The results overturned the popular image of Vikings as a genetically uniform group of blonde raiders almost immediately. As the study's own authors put it directly in interviews following publication, Viking identity turned out not to be limited strictly to people carrying genuine Scandinavian genetic ancestry at all. Some individuals recovered from Viking-era burial sites in places like Scotland, buried with full ceremonial Viking honors, weapons, boats, and grave goods included, turned out to carry no detectable Scandinavian ancestry whatsoever. These were, in practical terms, local people who had adopted Viking cultural identity, burial customs, and material culture, without carrying any of the underlying Scandinavian bloodline that popular imagination automatically assumes accompanied that identity. Science magazine's own coverage of the study summarized the finding with a line that circulated widely at the time. Viking, it turns out, functioned considerably more like a job description than a matter of strict heredity. Even more strikingly, the same research found that Viking-era Scandinavia itself already carried far more genetic diversity flowing in from southern and eastern Europe than researchers had previously expected going into the study. The study's abstract states this directly. The Viking period involved substantial gene flow into Scandinavia from the south and east, alongside detectable genetic structure within Scandinavia itself, including specific diversity hotspots concentrated in the southern regions and comparatively restricted gene flow between different parts of Scandinavia. In other words, the Vikings were never a closed, genetically insulated group that simply expanded outward from an untouched homeland. They were already a genuinely mixed population, well before any of them ever stepped aboard a longship bound for foreign shores, and the older steppe-related ancestry that had entered the region thousands of years earlier never disappeared either. It remained detectable underneath every subsequent wave of migration and contact, sitting quietly in the genetic record like bedrock beneath newer layers of sediment. The study also mapped out clear, specific directional settlement patterns that had previously only existed as historical assumption, now backed directly by genetic evidence. Researchers found strong evidence for a major influx of specifically Danish ancestry into England, a Swedish genetic influx into the Baltic region, and Norwegian ancestry flowing specifically into Ireland, Iceland, and Greenland. This lines up precisely with the general historical picture long assumed by scholars studying Viking-era raiding and settlement patterns, but the Margarian study was the first research to actually confirm these specific national-level genetic pathways using direct ancient DNA evidence rather than inference drawn from historical texts and archaeological artifact distribution alone. One especially vivid detail buried within the broader dataset deserves particular attention because it captures something the raw statistics alone don't fully convey. Among the 442 sequenced individuals, researchers identified 4 brothers, close biological siblings who had died on the exact same day, recovered together from a single shared boat burial in Estonia. That single detail transforms an abstract genetic dataset into something considerably more human and immediate. A Viking raiding party that included actual family members traveling and, ultimately, dying together on the same expedition. This is where the actual science collides directly with cultural identity, and that collision hasn't gone smoothly in every corner of public discourse surrounding this research. For some people, the idea that Vikings were never a genetically pure, unified Scandinavian bloodline feels like a direct challenge to a carefully constructed national identity. Nordic countries have spent the better part of the last century building substantial cultural pride specifically around Viking heritage, reflected in museums, annual festivals, and extensive tourism campaigns that lean heavily into the warrior ancestor narrative as a core part of national branding. Discovering that some individuals buried as Vikings were, genetically speaking, locally recruited converts with zero Scandinavian ancestry complicates that carefully maintained story considerably. On the other side of this same cultural collision, the discovery of Finland's specific genetic bottleneck has occasionally been misused in a different, equally troubling direction, sometimes framed in certain corners of the Internet as evidence of some kind of meaningful separateness or, worse, implied inferiority. That framing echoes almost exactly the kind of pseudo-scientific thinking that plagued this entire field of research a full century ago. And it's worth being direct about the fact that geneticists actively working on this material have pushed back explicitly and repeatedly against that specific interpretation. A population bottleneck, in the actual technical scientific sense, is a statistical demographic event caused by founder effects and geographic isolation. It carries no meaningful implication whatsoever about purity, distinctiveness, or biological hierarchy in the way certain online nationalist narratives have occasionally tried to twist it into meaning. What's genuinely fascinating about all of this research, once you set the cultural baggage aside entirely, is how thoroughly it cuts against nearly every simplified version of Nordic identity that popular culture has built up over the last century or more. The blonde, blue-eyed Viking stereotype turns out to represent, at best, only one small slice of a much messier, considerably more genetically diverse historical reality, one stretching all the way back through Ice Age hunter-gatherers, steppe nomads arriving thousands of years before the Viking Age even began, and centuries of ongoing genetic contact with the rest of Europe that never actually stopped, even during the specific decades most closely associated with Viking raiding and expansion. There's also a considerably older, deeper layer of ancestry sitting beneath all of this more recent Viking-era history, one that connects Scandinavia to a genuinely unexpected corner of the world. Separate research into depopulation genetics has identified a significant genetic contribution across Scandinavian populations, tracing back to a group geneticists refer to as ancient North Eurasians, an Ice Age hunter-gatherer population whose clearest known representative comes from a roughly 24,000-year-old boy's remains recovered near Lake Baikal in Siberia, at a site called Malta, first sequenced and published by a research team led by S.K. Willerslev himself back in 2014. This same ancient North Eurasian genetic signature, remarkably, also shows up as a substantial component of Native American ancestry, meaning a genuine, deep, prehistoric genetic thread connects the far north of Scandinavia to the indigenous populations of the Americas, established thousands of years before the Vikings themselves ever crossed the North Atlantic and reached Newfoundland around the year 1000 CE. It's worth being precise that this specific finding comes from a separate earlier body of research into deep Eurasian population history, distinct from the 2020 Viking-era study itself, though both bodies of research fit together into the same broader picture of Nordic genetic history stretching back tens of thousands of years. Survival in this specific environment, one defined by brutal cold and months of near-total winter darkness, also drove measurable documented genetic adaptation over time. Researchers studying pigmentation-associated genetic markers have found clear evidence of strong, ongoing selection pressure acting on Nordic populations over the past 1,000 years specifically, pushing toward the pale skin and light eye coloration commonly associated with the region today. Adaptations broadly understood to help the body absorb enough ultraviolet light for vitamin D production during months of extremely limited sunlight exposure. Alongside this, researchers have also documented positive selection acting on the lactase persistence gene, the specific genetic mutation that allows adults to continue digesting lactose in milk well into adulthood, a trait that would have carried genuine survival value in a region where dairy farming became an increasingly critical food source, particularly during the kind of harsh seasonal famines that periodically struck pre-modern Scandinavian communities. The Margrian study specifically traced positively selected genetic loci, including this lactase persistence variant of the LCT gene, alongside immune response-associated variants of a gene called ANCA, directly within their Viking-era genetic dataset, giving researchers a genuinely rare, detailed window into evolution, actively working on a human population within a relatively narrow, well-documented historical time frame. It's worth noting directly that the picture of what Viking-era Scandinavians actually looked like, based on the genetic evidence, surprised even the researchers running the study. Following the 2020 paper's publication, the study's authors stated publicly, in coverage carried by outlets, including National Geographic, that Viking-era individuals in their dataset appeared considerably darker in complexion than the average modern Scandinavian, a genuinely striking finding given how completely the pale-skinned stereotype dominates popular imagination surrounding this specific historical period. This particular claim generated some genuine pushback and discussion within the broader genetics community afterward regarding exactly how confidently pigmentation can be inferred from ancient genomic data using current methods, and it's a detail worth presenting with appropriate nuance rather than as a fully settled, uncontroversial fact, even though it reflects exactly what the study's own authors stated directly in their public comments following publication. One of the more genuinely striking geographic case studies to emerge from this broader body of research involves Iceland specifically, and it tells a distinctly grim story once you actually look closely at where the island's founding population's genetic material actually came from. Separate, well-established genetic research into Icelandic population history, conducted independently from the 2020 Viking World Study, has found that the island's founding population reflects a genuinely stark asymmetry between paternal and maternal ancestry. The majority of Iceland's founding paternal lineages trace directly back to Norse settlers, largely matching the popular image of Viking-era Scandinavian expansion. But the majority of the island's founding maternal lineages trace instead to Celtic populations, largely Irish and Scottish women, who were, according to the same body of research, brought to Iceland as captives during the same broader wave of Viking-era raiding and settlement across the British Isles. That specific asymmetry, Norse fathers, Celtic mothers, forming the genetic foundation of an entire nation, represents one of the more genuinely uncomfortable, historically grim details embedded directly within Iceland's own documented genetic record, and it's a finding that stands independently confirmed by multiple separate genetic studies of the Icelandic population over the past several decades. It's also worth being direct about the specific limitations of even this landmark 2020 research, because responsible science reporting requires acknowledging exactly where current data still fall short. Researchers working directly on the Margarian dataset have themselves acknowledged that sampling across this study skews unevenly across different regions. Scandinavia itself is comparatively well represented in the sequenced genomes. Other regions touched significantly by Viking-era expansion, including the wider Baltic region. The Rus River trading network stretching into what is now Russia and Ukraine, the Irish Sea coastal communities, and Normandy in France remain considerably less represented in the current genetic dataset. There is also a documented bias toward wealthier, more elaborate burials with better bone preservation conditions, meaning individuals from poorer households, rural communities, and enslaved populations, groups that made up a very real and historically significant portion of Viking-era society, remain meaningfully undersampled relative to their actual historical presence and importance. This is a genuinely active, ongoing area of research, not a fully closed scientific question, and future studies expanding sample coverage into these currently underrepresented regions and social groups will likely continue refining and in some cases potentially complicating the picture researchers currently have. So where does putting all of this actual verified research together actually leave the broader Nordic origin story? The honest, evidence-based picture looks considerably more layered and complicated than either the old nationalist mythology or a simple, tidy replacement narrative would suggest. Nordic populations descend from at least two genuinely separate waves of Ice Age hunter-gatherers arriving from different geographic directions, reshaped dramatically roughly 4,000 years ago by steppe migrations that reshaped much of the rest of Europe at the exact same time, then further diversified by genuine, ongoing genetic contact that continued straight through the Viking Age itself, even as Viking cultural identity simultaneously spread outward through conquest, trade, and, in a meaningful number of documented cases, straightforward cultural adoption by local populations carrying no Scandinavian genetic ancestry whatsoever. Finland's genuinely distinct genetic profile isn't evidence of some deeper, more ancient separateness existing for its own sake. It's the visible, well-documented statistical signature of a specific demographic bottleneck event, layered directly on top of the same deep underlying ancestry Finland genuinely shares with its immediate Nordic neighbors. This was never fundamentally a story about biological purity, and the actual genetic evidence makes that considerably clearer with every new study published in this field. It's a story about geographic isolation producing genuine distinctiveness in some specific places, while constant ongoing contact and genetic mixing simultaneously produced surprising diversity in others, frequently occurring within the exact same overarching culture and historical period. The Viking Age specifically, the single historical era most closely associated in popular culture with one unified fierce Nordic identity, turns out, according to the actual genetic evidence currently available, to represent one of the single most genetically mixed periods in the entire documented history of the region. The raiders themselves were never defending or representing some pure, unbroken bloodline reaching back into deep antiquity. They were, according to their own DNA, already living proof that cultural identity and genetic ancestry had decisively parted ways, long before anyone ever bothered writing any of it down in a saga or a chronicle. What actually survived across all of these centuries of migration, contact, isolation, and mixing wasn't a pure, untouched Nordic gene pool in the way popular imagination continues to picture it. It was instead a genuinely adaptable regional population, one that absorbed outside genetic contributions just as readily and just as consistently as it launched raids against outside populations, layering steppe ancestry, southern and eastern European genetic contact, Celtic captives, and locally recruited converts on top of a foundation stretching back to two separate waves of Ice Age hunter-gatherers, all while simultaneously producing measurable real evolutionary adaptations to one of the most physically demanding environments anywhere in Europe. The blonde, blue-eyed Viking of popular imagination isn't entirely a fiction, but it was never remotely the whole picture, and the actual DNA, recovered directly from Viking-era graves across Europe and Greenland, tells a story considerably stranger, considerably more layered, and, in its own way, considerably more genuinely remarkable than the version of Nordic history most people grew up believing.